Lama Zopa Rinpoche was always very enthusiastic about the idea of taking the Jade Buddha on a world tour. He said, if you leave the Buddha in one place, then only a few can see it. But if you take the Buddha around the world, it makes it so easy for billions of beings to receive the blessings of the Jade Buddha. We started making arrangements for the tour while we were still completing the Jade Buddha in Thailand. We'd received a lot of support for the Jade Buddha from Amitabha Buddhist Centre and several individuals in Singapore, and it seemed natural to Judy and to myself that the first showing of the Jade Buddha should be in Singapore. One of our key supporters in Singapore, Henry Lau, had spoken to a very large Chinese temple about hosting the Jade Buddha, and the early signs were very positive. Judy and I visited the temple with some friends of Henry Lau, and we answered a lot of questions, and we left the meeting feeling that the temple management was keen to be associated with the Jade Buddha. The temple was very beautiful, and what particularly interested me was that it had enough land to properly display the Jade Buddha and to allow for adequate car parking. This is a rarity in Singapore where land is so expensive. Around this time we advertised for a Jade Buddha tour coordinator to help us with the planning of the world tour. From a range of candidates, we selected Serene Loy. Serene was a computer programmer who lived in Brisbane, but perhaps as a sign of the Singapore connection, she was also a Singapore citizen. To be sure that we were making the right choice, we asked Lama Zopa Rinpoche for a divination to confirm our candidate. Rinpoche threw the mo, and it came out that Serene had a very positive connection to the Jade Buddha project. Serene has continued in this role in a voluntary capacity to the present day. In late 2008, a long-term supporter of the Jade Buddha project and the Great Stupa, Lan Nguyen, called me from Adelaide. Lan said that I must meet a certain abbot from Ho Chi Minh City who was visiting Australia. She explained that Thich Chan Tin was the abbot of one of Ho Chi Minh City's largest temples, and he was only in Melbourne for one more day. She added that I had to go immediately if I was to meet with the abbot. With some reservations that I might be wasting half a day of work, I agreed to the meeting and drove to an address in Western Melbourne. It was not a temple, but rather a suburban house with one internal wall that had been taken out to make enough room to create a makeshift temple. I was ushered into a small room where the abbot and an attendant waited for me. Now, before I'd received the phone call from Lan, I had not heard of Thich Chan Tin or Huang Fap Temple, but as soon as I went into that room, I was very impressed by the calm but powerful energy of this monk. He explained that his temple, Huang Fap, was very well known in Vietnam for holding many major retreats and Dharma events. He said that they were very experienced in hosting events for 30,000 people or more, and I saw photographs of these events and was so impressed by the professionalism of their presentation. The conversation then moved on to what we were doing at the Great Stupa of Universal Compassion and the Jade Buddha for Universal Peace. Even though Thich Chan Tin appeared to know quite a lot about both of these projects, he still asked me many questions. Then after about 1 hour, he said without hesitation, "I wish to invite the Jade Buddha to come to Vietnam." I replied, well, it would be very good to take the Jade Buddha to Vietnam, but first we have plans to go to Singapore and then probably Malaysia and Australia. And I said, well, maybe we can come to Vietnam in 1 or 2 years' time. Thich Chan Tin shook his head, smiled and said with soft-spoken firmness, "I want Vietnam to be the first place for the Jade Buddha tour." I took a few moments to reflect and then responded, well, if you can arrange for all the appropriate approvals, then Vietnam will be the first stop on the world tour of the Jade Buddha. We shook hands, and so the world tour program was underway. Judy and I were very happy that Vietnam was the first place on the world tour. It seemed to us to be a very good way to thank the many Vietnamese Australians who had been so kind to us over the years. And indeed, most Vietnamese people in Australia and all over the world have told us how proud they are that Vietnam was chosen as the first stop on the world tour of the Jade Buddha for Universal Peace. Also, in hindsight, making Vietnam the first stop proved to be the most serendipitous choice because the tour and the subsequent DVD of the tour of Vietnam caused such an impression, it was like a shockwave around the world. Suddenly, hundreds of Vietnamese temples wanted to invite the Jade Buddha and to pay homage to the Jade Buddha, and this created a momentum for the very successful world tour. Shortly after the meeting with Thich Nhat Hanh, we heard news from Singapore that the temple that Henry Lau had spoken to was going cool on the idea of hosting the Jade Buddha. Serene, Loy and I were in Singapore at that time, and the front page of the Straits Times carried news of a national scandal involving a Buddhist monk who was accused of using funds inappropriately. This atmosphere was enough for the temple to become extremely nervous about entering into any relationship with a foreign project. It was to be another 3 years before an opportunity to show the Jade Buddha in Singapore could be arranged. While the tour of Singapore was not to proceed as Henry Lau had wished, Judy and I had the privilege of one final meeting with him as he lay dying in a Singapore private hospital. We were able to tell Henry that the Jade Buddha was now completed and that the world tour was getting underway in Vietnam. We also had the opportunity to thank Henry for his devoted support. True to his word, Thich Nhat Hanh organised everything for the tour of Vietnam. He helped gain the official support and he selected the energetic and well-respected Buddhist nun Sukho Hue Duk to coordinate the tour. In February 2009, I travelled to Vietnam with Lan Nguyen, the person who had put me in touch with Thich Nhat Hanh. Later on, I was joined by an old friend from Brisbane, Mr. Bang. Together with Sukho Hue Duk, we travelled around Vietnam to meet with representatives of the abbots of Ho Chi Minh City and to visit the temples that were to host the Jade Buddha. From Ho Chi Minh City, we travelled to Quan Am Temple in the Marble Mountain area of Da Nang, to Dai Tung Lam at Barrier Vung Tau, to Pho Quang and Hoang Phap near Ho Chi Minh City, and to the very remote Dong Tap Temple. Wherever we went in Vietnam, we were met with generous hospitality and a real enthusiasm that the Jade Buddha would visit their temple. By the time I left, I felt sure that the Jade Buddha World Tour would get off to a most auspicious start in Vietnam. We then started in earnest to plan for the World Tour. We decided that the jade halo that goes behind the head of the Buddha was too heavy to display. It would be impossible to find a way of safely hanging the halo behind the head of the Buddha. So we created 2 fiberglass halos which we would use for the world tour. The Jade Buddha sits upon an enormous block of alabaster which is being carved into a traditional Tibetan-style throne that was designed by Thupten Khedup. The alabaster throne would also be far too heavy and fragile to transport around the world. And so we decided to create a faux throne, which is made of a very strong steel frame with fiberglass fairings. Wherever we go around the world, people ask us, how do you shift such a large and precious statue? This question was exercising our mind and those of Winneet's team in Thailand. Winneet had an engineer design a steel cage which would surround the Jade Buddha. He then wrapped the steel cage in plywood, covered this in plastic sheeting, and the steel cage around the Buddha remained with the Buddha for the next 18 months until it was replaced with a much simpler, lighter frame in Long Beach, California. This was how the Buddha and its throne were wrapped when they were loaded on the flat track container for Vietnam.